Let us be frank. The art world, for all its posturing about truth and beauty, has a notoriously short memory for the unsavory. We prefer our geniuses tortured, yes, but poetically so. We crave the myth of the suffering artist, the misunderstood visionary who bleeds onto the canvas for our later consumption, a sanctified offering for the altars of our museums. And in the pantheon of such figures, Egon Schiele reigns supreme. A gaunt, bug-eyed saint of modernism, conveniently martyred by the Spanish flu at the tender age of 28. His narrative arc, tidily concluded before he could succumb to the banalities of middle age, or the potential exhaustion of his own incandescent talent. His work, we are told in hushed and reverent tones, is a searing exploration of the human psyche, a raw, unfiltered confrontation with the twin demons of sexuality and mortality. And it is. Of that, there is no question. But to leave the story there, to curate the man as we curate his drawings in their climate-controlled vitrines, to sanitize his life for the sake of preserving the art's palatability, is a profound act of intellectual cowardice. It is a disservice not only to history, but to the very essence of what makes his work so potent, so enduringly, and so magnificently unsettling. To truly understand the jagged, desperate energy of a Schiele line, a line that seems not so much drawn as incised upon the paper by a quivering nerve, one must be willing to look at the man in full. One must confront the darkness he himself cultivated, and at times, reveled in with an almost gleeful abandon. This is not an exercise in posthumous judgment, nor is it an attempt to apply the flimsy and ever-shifting moral standards of our time to a bygone era. That would be a fool's errand. Rather, it is an exercise in radical honesty. It is an attempt to understand the source of the fire that forged his art, a fire fueled as much by a chilling narcissism, a calculated cruelty, and a vampiric disregard for the emotional lives of others, as it was by a transcendent, once-in-a-generation talent. Schiele the man was often monstrous. Schiele the artist was sublime. The central uncomfortable truth is that the latter could not have existed without the former. The sublime was born of the monstrous, and to pretend otherwise is to fundamentally misunderstand the work itself. What he would hate for you to know is not a collection of sordid secrets, but the simple damning fact that his artistic genius was inextricably intertwined with, and dependent upon, a profound failure of character. First, we must dispense with the romantic, almost pathetic notion of Schiele the misunderstood waif, a delicate flower crushed by the brutish philistinism of his time. He was, by every credible account, a profoundly, almost pathologically, narcissistic individual. This was not the garden-variety vanity of a handsome youth, but a deep-seated messianic conviction of his own singular importance. His obsession with his own image, resulting in a torrent of over 100 self-portraits in a career that spanned barely a decade, was not merely an artistic exploration of the self in the tradition of Rembrandt or Dürer. It was a fixation, a compulsive need to see himself reflected, refracted, and remade into a pantheon of his own creation. In these works, he is by turns a saint, his emaciated body an echo of Christian martyrs, his fingers elongated in prayer-like gestures. He is a prophet, his eyes wide not with fear but with the terrible burden of a vision the rest of us are too blind to see. He is a creature of raw, almost feral, exhibitionistic sexuality, his body contorted, his genitals exposed with a confrontational glare that dares the viewer to be shocked. He presents himself as a vessel for a higher artistic truth, a seer misunderstood by the bovine masses. Look at his 1912 self-portrait with Chinese lanterns. He is not merely an artist in his studio. He is a holy man, flanked by the exotic fruit-like lanterns, his head cocked in an attitude of beatific suffering. Or consider his nude self-portrait, grimacing from 1910, a masterpiece of self-loathing and defiance. This is not introspection, it is performance. He is showing us his pain, curating his anguish for public display. This messianic complex was not a private affectation. It was the core operating system of his personality. He styled himself as a sage, a clairvoyant, a man who felt things more deeply, more intensely, more authentically than anyone else. And perhaps he did. But this heightened sensitivity was yoked to an ego of monumental, almost suffocating proportions. An ego that demanded constant validation and saw the world primarily as a mirror for its own dramas. He once wrote in a letter, "I am a human being. I love death, and I love life. A statement of such grandiose banality that it could only come from a young man utterly convinced of his own profundity. This wasn't the humble, introspective melancholy of a Van Gogh, who saw starry nights and felt the hand of God. This was the performative anguish of a man who saw his own suffering, his own desires, his own body as the most compelling subject in the universe. He was, as one astute critic noted, engaged in a constant search for another self, a more dramatic and tragic version of his own persona, rather than any attempt to mend the glaring flaws in his character. His signature itself became a statement, often enclosed in a box, branded onto the page with an assertion of ownership that went beyond mere identification. He was not just painting a picture. He was marking his territory. This relentless, all-consuming self-focus had profound and often destructive consequences for those unlucky enough to be pulled into his orbit, particularly the women who served as his models, muses, and lovers. They were the raw material for his art, the fuel for his creative furnace, and like all fuel, they were ultimately consumed. Let us speak plainly of Wally Newsel. In the sanitized art history for beginners version of the SCHIELE myth, while Agonizing is the tragic muse, the beautiful, devoted companion who stood by him through thick and thin, the silent partner in his genius, only to be heartlessly cast aside for a more socially acceptable wife. This narrative is true, as far as it goes. But it is a pale, bloodless shadow of the reality. The truth of the matter is far crueler and far more revealing of Sheila's character. Wally, who met Sheila in 1911 when she was just 17, and he a magnetic 21, was his everything. She was not merely a passive model. She was his lover, his confidant, his business manager, his emotional bedrock. Having previously modeled for his mentor, Gustav Klimt, and rumored to have been his mistress, she was no stranger to the Viennese art world's bohemian, often predatory circles. She was a survivor. When Sheila, disgusted with the conservatism of Vienna, decided to retreat to his mother's hometown, the picturesque but provincial Krumau, Wally went with him. They were a scandal from the moment they arrived. Their cohabitation, his use of local teenage girls as models for his explicit drawings, and their general disregard for bourgeois convention, quickly earned them the ire of the townsfolk. They were, in essence, driven out of town. It was during this period, after they had resettled in Neulengbach, that the defining crisis of Sheila's life occurred, the infamous 1912 arrest. The charges were devastatingly serious: seduction and abduction of a minor. While those specific charges were ultimately dropped, likely due to a lack of concrete evidence, he was convicted of the lesser crime of exhibiting erotic drawings in a place accessible to children. The image is seared into the annals of art history. The judge, in a fit of theatrical moral outrage, burning one of the offending drawings over a candle flame in the courtroom. Sheila spent 24 days in prison, an experience that both traumatized him and profoundly reinforced his persecution complex. He filled a diary with drawings and writings, casting himself as an artist martyr, crucified by a society that could not comprehend his genius. He wrote, "To constrain an artist is a crime. It is to murder budding life. The sheer arrogance is breathtaking, and throughout this entire ordeal, the public humiliation, the arrest, the trial, the imprisonment, it was Wally who remained loyal. It was Wally who brought him food, paper, and pencils in his cell. It was Wally who faced the whispers and the accusations. She was, in every meaningful sense, the emotional and practical scaffolding of his life during his most turbulent and artistically explosive years. She provided him with a stability, a grounding, that allowed his genius to flourish untethered. She was the anchor in the storm of his own making. And how did he repay this unwavering, life-sustaining devotion? With a calculated act of psychological cruelty so profound it almost beggars belief. In 1915, his ambition, which had always been a ravenous beast, began to outweigh his bohemian loyalties. His gaze fell upon the Harm sisters, Edith and Adele, who lived in a respectable middle-class apartment across the street from his Vienna studio. They were the embodiment of what he lacked and what he now craved: social legitimacy. They were Protestant, bourgeois, and marriageable in a way that Wally, with her murky past and working-class origins, could never be. In a letter to his friend and patron, Arthur Roessler, Sheila coolly laid out his plan with the dispassionate logic of a business merger. The letter is one of the most damning documents in the history of modern art. He announced his intention to marry, and then wrote the fatal words, I intend to get married advantageously, not to Wally. Advantageously. Let that word sink in. This was not a decision of the heart, a grand passion that swept him off his feet. It was a career move, a cold, hard calculation designed to launder his reputation and secure his place in the very bourgeois world he affected to despise. But the true measure of his callousness, the detail that elevates this from a simple, if sad, breakup to an act of monstrous egotism, lies in what he proposed next. He did not simply end his 4-year relationship with the woman who had been his everything. Instead, he sat Wally down and presented her with a formal, almost contractual proposition. He would marry Edith, he explained, but he expected Wally to remain his mistress. He laid out the terms. He would swear his loyalty to her, and she would be a permanent fixture in his life. He even went so far as to suggest, with a staggering lack of empathy, that the three of them, he, his new wife, and his mistress, should take an annual vacation together. It is a moment that reveals the man in his entirety. The narcissist so convinced of his own irresistible importance that he believed he could bend reality and human hearts to his will. He saw these women not as independent beings with their own emotional lives, but as satellites orbiting the bright hot star of his genius. He wanted the social stability of a wife and the untamed devotion of a mistress. He wanted it all, and he could not comprehend why he should not have it. It is a testament to Wally's immense strength of character and self-respect that she did not slap him. She did not scream. She simply stood up, walked out of the cafe, and never saw him again. She vanished from his life as suddenly as she had entered it. His artistic reckoning with this betrayal is his 1915 masterpiece, Death and the Maiden. It is a devastating self-indictment. The two figures, their bodies emaciated and clinging, are locked in a final, agonizing embrace on a barren, shroud-like cloth. He is death, his face skeletal, his eyes black voids of despair. She is the maiden. Her face turned away, but her red hair, Wally's hair, a vibrant splash of life against the funereal tones of the painting. Her arms are wrapped around him not in love, but in a desperate, futile attempt to hold on. It is his farewell to the woman he had sacrificed on the altar of his ambition, a monumental painting born from an act of personal treachery. He knew what he had done. The painting is his confession, but it is also, in the deeply twisted logic of the narcissist, his justification, transforming a grubby personal failure into a grand, tragic, universal statement. Wally, for her part, did not crumble. She demonstrated a resilience that SCHIELE, for all his performative strength, likely never possessed. She trained as a Red Cross nurse and went to work in a military hospital in Dalmatia, throwing herself into the crucible of the Great War. It was there, in 1917, that she died of scarlet fever at the age of just 23. Her life, post-SCHIELE, was short, but it was her own. His marriage to Edith was, by all accounts, a more placid affair. Initially, his work seemed to reflect this newfound domesticity. His lines became softer, his compositions more naturalistic. For a time, Edith was his primary, even his only model. His portraits of her, like the famous 1915 portrait of the artist's wife, show her seated, corseted, contained within the frame and within the conventions of bourgeois portraiture. Compare this to his drawings of Wally, who is almost always depicted naked, her body a vector of raw, untamed energy. The contrast is stark and speaks volumes. Wally was a collaborator in his rebellion. Edith was a prop for his respectability. But the beast of his artistic and personal obsessions could not be caged for long. SCHIELE's aesthetic preference was for a very specific physique, lean, angular, fragile, almost boyish. As Edith's body naturally matured and softened in marriage, his artistic interest in her waned. He soon turned his attention to her younger sister Adele, who better fit his aesthetic mold. He began to ask her to model for him, a request that created palpable tension within the household. Adele, much later in life, hinted that her relationship with her famous brother-in-law was not entirely virtuous, suggesting a layer of domestic transgression and betrayal that simmered just beneath the surface of their respectable life. Once again, SCHIELE's desires, both artistic and personal, took precedence over the emotional well-being of those closest to him. To fully excavate the roots of this profound psychological dysfunction, we must look to the shadow that loomed over his entire life. His father, Adolf Schiele, the elder Schiele, a station master for the Austrian state railways, died in 1905 from the late stages of syphilis when EGON was just 14. This was not a peaceful passing. The disease had driven him into a state of mental confusion, paranoia, and violent rages. For a sensitive, artistic boy on the cusp of adolescence, witnessing the mental and physical disintegration of his father was a primal trauma, an unforgettable spectacle of madness and decay. This early, intimate encounter with death and disease undoubtedly shaped his art's obsessive focus on the fragility of the human body, on sickness, decay, and the skull beneath the skin. His relationship with his family in the wake of this tragedy was fraught and complex. He harbored a deep and lasting resentment towards his mother, whom he accused of being cold, unloving, and not mourning his father with sufficient passion. He believed she actively discouraged his artistic pursuits, at one point claiming she had maliciously destroyed his treasured childhood sketchbooks. Whether this is objective fact or the self-serving narrative of a teenager who felt misunderstood is difficult to determine, but the feeling of maternal rejection was real to him, and it fueled his sense of isolation. Even more unsettling are the persistent and disturbing questions surrounding his relationship with his younger sister, Gertrude, or Gertie. She was one of his earliest and most frequent models, and the drawings and paintings of her tread a deeply uncomfortable line. In works like the 1910 The Artist's Sister on Her Knees, she is depicted in a state of vulnerable undress, her pose suggestive, her gaze a mixture of innocence and something far more knowing. There is an emotional and psychological intensity to these images that feels qualitatively different from his other work. Scholars have long debated the nature of their bond, with the whispers of an incestuous relationship, or at least an emotionally incestuous one, never fully dissipating. Given his family trauma, the dead father, the resented mother, it is not a great psychological leap to see him forging an unusually close and perhaps transgressive bond with his sister, his first muse, and his first intimate subject. She was the template for the complex and often predatory dynamic that would define his relationships with women throughout his life. This tangled web of family trauma, combined with the hothouse atmosphere of fin de siècle Vienna, created the perfect toxic storm for Schille's art to emerge. Vienna around 1900 was a city of dazzling, almost schizophrenic contradictions. It was the glittering capital of a sprawling, decaying multinational empire, a crucible of intellectual and artistic innovation that gave the world Sigmund Freud's theories of the subconscious, Gustav Mahler's soul-searching symphonies, and the radical aesthetic rebellion of the Vienna Secession. But beneath the polished facade of the Ringstrasse, the waltzes, and the coffeehouse intellectualism lay a society in deep psychic distress. It was a city rife with social tensions, virulent anti-Semitism, and a morbid fascination with death. Prostitution was rampant, a shadow economy of desire, and venereal diseases like the syphilis that killed Schille's father were a whispered, terrifying scourge. The rigid sexual mores of the Victorian age clashed violently with the burgeoning exploration of the subconscious mind. This was the central tension of the era, the fault line that Freud would mine for his revolutionary theories of psychoanalysis. Rationality was giving way to a new understanding of humanity as creatures of instinct, neurosis, and buried desires. It was into this world, a world of gilded aestheticism and psychological decay, of sexual repression and erotic obsession, that Schiele unleashed his raw, confrontational, and deeply Freudian art. He was a product of his time, but he was also its most extreme and unapologetic expression. His relationship with Gustav Klimt, the Grand Master of the Vienna Secession and the reigning king of Viennese art, was crucial. Klimt recognized the boy's prodigious, almost frightening talent immediately. He took Schiele under his wing, buying his drawings, arranging models for him, and introducing him to the wealthy, often Jewish patrons who were the lifeblood of the Viennese avant-garde. Schiele's early work is heavily indebted to Klimt's decorative symbolist style, but the student quickly and ruthlessly devoured the master. Where Klimt's eroticism was gilded, opulent, and elegant, a sexuality veiled in myth and ornamentation, Schiele's was raw, angular, and brutally honest. He ripped away the golden fabric to expose the quivering nerve, the awkward flesh, the psychological truth beneath. He was not interested in idealized beauty. He was fascinated by ugliness, by the awkward, contorted, imperfect reality of the human body, and by the unvarnished truth of lust. He subverted centuries of artistic convention by presenting nudes who were not passive, reclining objects of male desire, but confrontational, self-aware subjects who stared back at the viewer with accusation, defiance, or desperate need. This unapologetic approach to sexuality, particularly his obsessive use of young and adolescent models, was the source of his greatest controversies and remains the most difficult aspect of his legacy. The residents of Krumau and Neulengbach were scandalized by the troops of disheveled children and teenage girls who would congregate at his studio. While the age of consent in Austria at the time was 14, and it was certainly not uncommon for men of his class to consort with underage working-class girls and prostitutes, Schiele's open, unapologetic, and artistic documentation of adolescent sexuality was seen as a profound transgression. His fascination with the awkward liminal state of puberty, the transition from the innocence of childhood to the knowledge of adulthood, was obsessive. He depicted pubescent girls with a frankness that still has the power to shock, capturing their bony limbs, budding breasts, and often vacant, world-weary gazes. It is this aspect of his life, his artistic and perhaps personal proximity to minors, that remains the most troubling and the most difficult to reconcile with our admiration for his artistic genius. He was not merely documenting a social reality, he was consumed by it, and his work forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the line between observation and exploitation. In the end, what are we to make of this deeply flawed, brilliant, and often repellent man? To ignore the darkness, the staggering narcissism, the calculated cruelty, the predatory relationships, the troubling obsessions, is to see only half the picture, and the less interesting half at that. It is precisely this volatile and undeniably toxic mixture of elements that gives his work its terrifying and enduring power. His art is not born of a serene, contemplative soul meditating on the human condition. It is the direct, unmediated product of a psyche in turmoil, a man grappling with profound childhood trauma, a monstrous and insatiable ego, and a voracious, often destructive, libido. He once wrote that a true work of art required the annihilation of the ego, yet his entire creative output was a monumental testament to its power. He sought to make his viewers seized with terror, and he succeeded, because his art is not a depiction of a feeling. It is the feeling itself, transmitted directly through the convulsive energy of his line. He would likely detest our picking apart the sordid details of his biography. He much preferred the grand myth of the artist prophet, the misunderstood genius martyred by a world too crude to appreciate him. He would hate that we know the cold, calculating words he wrote about Wally. He would hate that we see the bourgeois ambition behind his marriage to Edith. He would hate the lingering, sordid questions about his sister and his underage models. But it is in these uncomfortable, inconvenient, and ugly truths that we find the essential key to his art. The jagged lines, the emaciated bodies, the sallow, sickly colors, the stares of mingled anguish and defiance. These are not mere stylistic choices. They are the visual residue of a life lived on the edge, a life that burned with a brilliant, destructive, and ultimately self-consuming flame. In the autumn of 1918, at the height of his success following a triumphant exhibition at the Secession, the Spanish flu swept through Vienna. It took Edith, who was 6 months pregnant with their child, first. 3 days later it took him. He died having witnessed the death of his wife and unborn child, a final, brutal tragedy that seems almost prefigured in the morbid preoccupations of his art. To look away from his darkness, to whitewash his character in the service of making his art more palatable, is to fail to understand the light. It is to render his work toothless. The discomfort he provokes is the entire point. In the art of Egon Schiele, the sublime and the depraved, the sacred and the profane, the creative spark and the destructive impulse are not opposing forces. They are one and the same, forever and terrifyingly intertwined. And that, perhaps, is the most disturbing truth of all.